The cold, empty expanse of space stretched out in all directions. In the distance, a massive alien fleet loomed like a wall of darkness, their ships gleaming with an eerie light. Their advanced technology was a far cry from the rusted, battered human ship that slowly drifted toward them. The ship's hull was covered in scars from countless battles, its once shiny surface now dull and chipped. The hum of the ship's failing engines echoed through the corridors as it fought to stay in motion. Inside the command deck, Captain Ethan Blake stood at the front, staring at the view screen. His eyes, hardened by years of war, narrowed as he gazed at the alien ships in the distance. His hands clenched into fists, and he could feel the weight of the decision before him. The odds were impossible. His ship was old, outclassed, and outnumbered. There were no shields, no advanced weaponry, and no backup. It was just him and his ragtag crew against the might of an alien fleet that was far superior in every way. The alien ships sparkled with bright, menacing energy, their shields shimmering like walls of light that could block any attack. It seemed hopeless. "This is our last chance," Captain Blake whispered, his voice low but filled with grim determination. The crew gathered behind him, their faces filled with uncertainty. They all knew the gravity of the situation. He didn't have to say it out loud, but the weight of those words hung in the air. This was it, the final battle. There would be no second chances. We fight, or we die. Blake continued, turning to face his crew. Humanity's future is in our hands. His words were met with silence. The crew members exchanged uneasy glances, each of them struggling to keep their fears in check. They were just a small group of misfits, soldiers and engineers who had barely survived the last battle. Now they were being asked to fight an enemy that could obliterate them with a single strike. The silence was broken by a loud, insistent beeping. A warning alarm blared through the ship's speakers, piercing the tension in the air. Everyone turned toward the source of the sound, the view screen where the alien fleet was now closing in. "Alien ships locking onto our position," reported the ship's navigator, his voice shaky. "They've already begun targeting us. We don't have much time." Captain Blake's eyes never left the view screen as the alien ships began to move, their massive forms encroaching upon the human ship. The crew knew that they were out of options. Retreat wasn't an option. They would be pursued and destroyed without mercy. The only choice they had was to face the alien fleet head-on, no matter how much they feared the outcome. His first officer, Sarah, stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "Captain, we can't win this," she said softly, her voice trembling. "We're outmatched. Look at them. They have cloaking devices, robotic soldiers, weapons we can't even comprehend. If we engage them, we'll be wiped out in seconds." Blake turned to her, his eyes steady, filled with a fire that burned deep within him. "I know it," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "But we have no other choice. We don't fight for victory. We fight for survival. Humanity will never back down." He turned back to the view screen, where the alien fleet was now just moments away. He knew his crew was scared. He could feel it in the air, the weight of their fear pressing down on him. But he also knew something that they didn't. The aliens might be technologically advanced, but the humans had something they couldn't understand: courage, resourcefulness, the will to fight, even when all seemed lost. The alien ships continued to move forward, their energy shields glowing brighter with each passing moment. The human ship, in contrast, seemed like a fragile shell in the face of such overwhelming power. Blake's ship barely even had functioning engines. It was a relic of a long-forgotten war, patched together from whatever spare parts they could find. Yet here it was, the last line of defense for humanity. The warning alarm blared again, and Blake's heart raced as he watched the alien ships lock their weapons onto his ship. The crew stood frozen, the weight of the moment sinking in. This was it. There was no going back. "Prepare for impact," shouted Blake, his voice cutting through the tension. The crew quickly scrambled into their positions, securing their stations, and readying whatever meager weapons the ship had left. It was clear that they would not survive if they stayed in one place. They would have to be quick, use every ounce of creativity and resourcefulness. They had to stand a chance. Blake reached down and flipped a switch, activating the ship's aging pulse cannon. It was their only weapon capable of even denting the alien shields, but it had never been tested in such a high-stakes situation. The ship creaked and groaned as it powered up. The crew braced themselves for what was to come. As the alien ships neared, Blake's eyes narrowed. He could see the fear in his crew's eyes. They were just children compared to the alien forces. They had no experience with such high-tech warfare, but they had something the aliens didn't: human ingenuity, a willingness to risk everything. The alien ships suddenly vanished from the view screen, cloaking themselves in a blink. Blake's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't panic. The crew had trained for this, prepared for every contingency. He turned to his sensor officer. "Get them back on the screen. Now." The officer scrambled to his controls, fingers flying over the console. The tension in the air thickened as they waited. Finally, the sensor officer let out a sigh of relief. "I've got them. They're still cloaked, but I can track their energy signature. They're coming in fast." Blake's mind raced as he considered their options. "We don't have time to think. Everyone, prepare for evasive maneuvers. We're going to hit them first." The ship's engines roared to life, barely functioning but enough to make the ship move. The human ship swerved violently, dodging incoming fire from the alien fleet. The crew held on tight as they braced for the worst. Every inch of the ship screamed in protest as it maneuvered through the stars, dodging enemy fire and trying to survive. Blake's grip tightened on the control panel. "We're not going down without a fight." The alien ships, now uncloaked, began firing relentlessly, their beams of energy tearing through the vacuum of space. The human ship rocked violently under the barrage, sending crew members sprawling to the floor. Sparks flew from the consoles, and the ship's hull groaned under the strain. "We need to fight back," shouted Sarah, her voice frantic. Blake nodded, his jaw set with determination. "We're not retreating. We're going to make them regret underestimating humanity." As the battle raged on, Blake's crew worked together, their unity giving them the strength to face the overwhelming alien force. The odds were still impossibly stacked against them, but Blake refused to surrender. He would fight until the very last breath, not just for his crew, but for the future of all humanity. And so, the impossible decision was made. There was no turning back. The fight for humanity's survival had begun. Captain Ethan Blake stood at the helm, his eyes never straying from the view screen. The alien fleet was closing in, its enormous ships hovering like ominous shadows in the vastness of space. His hands gripped the controls with a quiet intensity, a flicker of resolve in his chest. The odds were stacked against them, but Blake refused to allow fear to overtake his crew. "All right, listen up." Blake's voice rang out through the ship's comms system, rallying his ragtag crew. "Humans may not have the tech, but we have the will to survive. They think we're nothing more than bugs to crush. Well, we're going to show them what happens when they underestimate us." His words weren't met with cheers or applause. Instead, the crew exchanged uneasy glances. Some faces were filled with fear, others with doubt. But there was something in Blake's voice that stirred a small spark of hope in each of them. They had fought before, on 1,000 different battlefields, against overwhelming odds, and they had lived to tell the tale. This time, however, was different. This time, they were facing an enemy that was not just technologically superior, but seemingly unstoppable. First Officer Sarah stood beside Blake, her expression tight with uncertainty. She had been by his side through countless missions, but this time, her confidence was shaken. The ship they were on, the Genesis, was nothing like the sleek, high-tech warships the aliens commanded. Its hull was battered and scarred from previous battles, its systems held together by patchwork repairs. There was no way it could match the aliens' technology, No way it could survive against an assault from such an advanced force. "Captain," Sarah said, her voice strained, "we're not ready. The ship's systems are barely functioning. We have no shields, no advanced weapons, no cloaking devices. We're sitting ducks out here. How can we possibly fight them?" Blake turned to her, his gaze steady and unshaken. "I know the situation, Sarah, but we have something they don't. We have the will to fight, the will to survive, and that's more powerful than any weapon." He looked around at his crew. Each of them mourned from the battles they had already fought, each of them carrying their own fear and uncertainty. The Genesis was all they had left, a dying relic of a time long past. But it was still a ship, still capable of fighting. And as long as it could move, it could fight back. "We don't need fancy gadgets," Blake continued. "We need to outsmart them. We need to be resourceful. And most of all, we need to be brave." There was a moment of silence as the crew absorbed his words. Some of them nodded. Others remained skeptical. But Blake could feel the tension in the air beginning to shift, just slightly. They were scared, yes, but they were also human, and humans had a way of surprising the universe. The crew sprang into action, working around the clock to activate whatever systems they could. Engineers scrambled to power up the pulse cannon, the only weapon this ship had that might be able to do some damage. Technicians worked feverishly to bring the ship's shields online, though they knew they wouldn't be able to withstand much. But there was no choice. They had to try. Blake moved through the corridors, checking in on each crew member, offering words of encouragement. He saw the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty in their movements, but he also saw something else: determination. The Genesis might not be much, but it was their ship, and it was going to be their home for however long they had left. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, Admiral Kylan surveyed the human ship through his own view screen. His eyes, glowing a piercing blue, scanned the aging vessel that had dared to challenge his fleet. He was a being of cold logic, his mind programmed to calculate every possible scenario. To him, the humans were nothing more than a fleeting nuisance, an insignificant species that had no business standing in the way of his fleet. His ships, AI-controlled and equipped with cloaking devices, were far superior to anything the humans could ever hope to muster. The human's pathetic little ship wasn't even worth his time, but he had been ordered to wipe them out, and so he would. Cylon's voice echoed through the comm system, his tone a mixture of amusement and contempt. "They think they can fight us. How quaint. Prepare the fleet for engagement, but remember, we will not be quick in destroying them. Let them know their place." His ships, sleek and powerful, began to encircle the Genesis, their cloaking devices flickering in and out of visibility. The fleet's weapon systems hummed with energy, ready to unleash devastating firepower on the humans. To Cylon, this was little more than a formality. The humans had no chance. It would be an easy victory. But Blake wasn't thinking about the odds. He wasn't thinking about how outmatched they were. He was thinking about his crew, about how they had come this far together, and how they would fight until their last breath. "We need to keep them on the defensive," Blake muttered to himself. He knew the alien fleet would begin to close in, but he also knew they had to act fast. They couldn't afford to wait for the aliens to make the first move. They needed to strike before they were surrounded. He could feel the tension rising in the crew as they worked frantically to prepare for the coming onslaught. As Blake made his way back to the command deck, a low rumble shook the ship. The alien fleet had begun to surround them, like a predator closing in on its prey. The Genesis rocked under the impact of the first salvo of energy blasts from the alien ships. The lights flickered, and the ship groaned in protest, its aging systems training to keep it operational. "Captain, shields are holding, but they won't last long," the ship's engineer reported. "We need more time." Blake nodded, his jaw set in determination. "We don't have time. We fight now, or we're done for." The ship's pulse cannon fired with a deep thrum, sending a burst of energy toward the nearest alien ship. The blast connected with the enemy's shields, causing them to flicker momentarily. It wasn't enough to do serious damage, but it sent a clear message. The humans weren't going down without a fight. The alien fleet responded with a barrage of fire, tearing into the Genesis's hull. Sparks flew from the ship's exposed systems, and alarms blared through the corridors. But Blake didn't flinch. He knew this was the moment that would define them. This was the moment when humanity would show that even against overwhelming odds, they would never give up. "We can't win this by just defending," Blake said, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "We need to make them pay for every inch they take from us." The crew scrambled, working together with a unity born of desperation and resolve. They may have been outmatched, but they had something the aliens didn't: the will to survive. Blake knew that as long as his crew held that spark, they could keep fighting, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. The alien fleet closed in, their weapons ready to strike, but the humans weren't giving up. Blake's crew, the underestimated underdogs, had decided that today would not be the day they fell. Today would be the day they proved their worth. Today would be the day they made the impossible decision to fight and live. The first blow from the alien fleet hit with devastating force. The Genesis shuddered violently, alarms blaring as the ship's shields flickered and sparked under the intense energy. The crew staggered as the ship rocked again, the metal groaning in protest. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the entire crew was plunged into darkness. Panic surged through the air, but Blake's calm voice cut through it like a beacon. "Hold your ground." Captain Ethan Blake's voice echoed across the comms, steady and unwavering. "We will survive this, or we'll die fighting." The alien fleet was relentless. Their ships, sleek and powerful, tore into the human vessel with terrifying precision. Beams of bright energy lashed out, impacting the Genesis's hull and sending tremors through the entire ship. The crew fought against the mounting panic, their hands working furiously to keep the ship operational. The damage was severe. Sparks flew from the exposed circuits, and the ship's outer armor was beginning to buckle. The first officer, Sarah, rushed to the engineering deck, barking orders at the engineers to stabilize the ship's systems. But there was little they could do. The alien ships were too fast, their cloaking technology making it nearly impossible to track their movements. The Genesis was moving slowly, struggling to keep up with the alien fleet's devastating strikes. "We need to fight back, or we won't make it," Sarah shouted, her voice strained with the urgency of the situation. Blake was already ahead of her, turning to the crew and his eyes burning with determination. "Prepare the torpedoes. We may be outdated, but we still have a shot." The crew scrambled, loading the old, rusty torpedoes into the launch tubes. These weapons had been scavenged from previous encounters, far less sophisticated than anything the aliens possessed. But Blake wasn't interested in the odds. He was focused on the fight ahead. "Aim for their engines. If we can disable them, we have a chance." The pulse cannon, a last-ditch weapon that had been heavily damaged in previous battles, hummed to life. The crew had no illusions about its effectiveness, but it was all they had. The energy built up in the cannon, crackling with raw power. As Blake shouted the command, the weapon fired, sending a brilliant blast of energy streaking toward the nearest alien ship. The shot struck, but the alien shields absorbed it with barely a ripple. The crew didn't let that stop them. They fired again, and again, hoping for a lucky hit. Even as the alien ships cloaked and reappeared, their attacks relentless. It was like fighting ghosts. Each alien ship appeared and disappeared in bursts of light, nearly impossible to track. In the midst of the chaos, Blake's mind raced. The Genesis was getting hammered, and their chances of survival were shrinking by the second. He needed to turn the tide, and fast. He had to use whatever he could, even the ship's damaged systems. "Sarah, get me an update on the pulse cannon targeting," Blake shouted. "We need to throw off their aim." Sarah's voice crackled through the comms. "The targeting systems are malfunctioning, Captain. It's almost impossible to lock onto their ships. Blake's gaze darted over the redouts. There was a spark of an idea, an unorthodox one, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Override the targeting system. We'll fire randomly, disrupt their scans. We'll make it impossible for them to predict where the next shot will come from. Without hesitation, Sarah issued the order. The crew worked fast, diverting energy and recalibrating the cannon. As the next shot was fired, the energy blast came from a completely unexpected angle, catching the alien fleet off guard. The alien ship's systems scrambled to adjust, their targeting computers unable to track the erratic shots. It wasn't a perfect strategy, but it worked, at least for now. Blake looked around at his crew. They were exhausted, battered by the constant barrage, but they were still fighting. The alien fleet wasn't giving them any room to breathe. And then, in a chilling moment, the unthinkable happened. The alien ships began to deploy robotic soldiers. They emerged from the belly of the ships, mechanical warriors with glowing red eyes and massive weapons. They weren't just going to destroy the Genesis from the outside. They were boarding the ship. The first wave of robotic soldiers clattered through the corridors of the Genesis, their heavy footsteps echoing like thunder. The humans were not prepared for this. The robots were designed for close-quarters combat, their strength and speed far beyond anything the crew could match. Panic surged, but Blake was already moving, barking orders as the crew grabbed whatever weapons they could find. Get to the corridors. We need to hold them off, no matter what. Blake commanded. The battle inside the ship was chaos. The robotic soldiers moved with terrifying precision, their weapons firing indiscriminately as they advanced. The human crew, armed with makeshift weapons, guns they had scavenged from past encounters, pipes, and even makeshift explosives, fought back with desperation. Each clash was a desperate struggle for survival. Blake was in the thick of it, his fists striking as he pushed through the chaos, rallying his crew. Keep pushing. They can't take us down. One by one, the robots fell to the crew's makeshift weapons. Each victory was hard-earned, and the cost of every inch gained was steep. The humans were not just fighting for their ship, they were fighting for their survival, their future. In the midst of the battle, Blake's mind raced with calculations. He knew they couldn't keep this up forever. The Genesis was falling apart, its systems barely functional, and the robots continued to pour in from the alien ships. The crew was outnumbered and outgunned, but there was one last card to play. He had to take the fight to them. "Sarah, is the pulse cannon ready?" Blake asked, his voice tight with urgency. "It's charging, Captain, but the power supply is unstable. We have one shot left." Blake took a deep breath. "Then make it count." As the alien robotic soldiers continued to infiltrate the ship, Blake ordered the crew to fall back. They had to make one last stand at the ship's control center. As they retreated, they fired off their final shots, hoping to slow down the alien advance long enough for Blake to execute his last-ditch plan. The pulse cannon hummed one final time, glowing with power as it prepared for its last shot. The energy built up, crackling with intensity. Blake knew that if this shot didn't disable the alien fleet's command ship, they were all dead. With a final roar, the pulse cannon fired, its energy streaking through the cold vacuum of space toward the heart of the alien fleet. The blast collided with the command ship, its shields failing under the sheer force of the attack. For a brief moment, the alien fleet faltered. It wasn't enough to destroy them, not yet, but it was enough to send a message. Humanity would not go down without a fight. And in that moment, Blake knew that even if they were to lose this battle, they had already won something far greater. They had proven that the spirit of humanity could not be crushed. The battle seemed endless. The Genesis was battered, its hull scarred by the relentless onslaught of the alien fleet. Blake had been pushing his crew beyond their limits, and yet the situation seemed hopeless. Every second brought another blast, another piece of the ship tearing away under the weight of the alien attacks. But Captain Blake's resolve never wavered. He had seen the worst that humanity could face and had never backed down. Now they were facing the impossible, but he couldn't allow them to lose. As the tension mounted, a thought struck Blake. In all the chaos, he'd noticed something strange. The alien ships had been flickering, disappearing and reappearing too unpredictably. But there was a pattern. Their cloaking technology, so advanced, seemed flawless. But Blake was no stranger to thinking outside the box, and he'd seen a flaw, a tiny crack in their perfect armor. The cloaking didn't fully conceal the ships when they reappeared from their cloaked state, leaving a momentary gap in their shields. Blake's mind raced as he analyzed the situation. He needed to act, and fast. "Sarah," Blake barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Is the EMP device still functional?" Sarah's voice came through the comms, tight with worry. "It's a long shot, Captain. We haven't used it in months. It could fry the entire system if it goes wrong." But Blake was resolute. "We don't have a choice. Use it. Now." The EMP device was one of the Genesis' few remaining weapons. The ship's technology was aging, and many of their systems were offline. But the EMP, though archaic, was still functional. It had been designed to disable enemy electronics by emitting a powerful electromagnetic pulse, a weapon of last resort. If they could use it against the alien fleet's cloaking system, they might stand a chance. As Sarah relayed the order to the engineering team, the crew's eyes widened with fear and anticipation. The EMP had the potential to change the course of the battle, but it was also a gamble. The risk of it backfiring and destroying the ship was real, but they had no other option. Blake's hand tightened around the command console as he watched the alien ships continue their assault. The massive warships hovered above, invisible to the naked eye, cloaked in their near-impenetrable shields. But now Blake knew exactly where to strike. With a deep breath, he watched the countdown to the EMP's activation tick down. Seconds felt like hours as the ship groaned and creaked under the strain of the ongoing assault. "EMP online." Sarah's voice came through the comms, steady despite the odds. "Ready to fire." Blake nodded, his gaze fixed on the view screen. This was it. Fire. The EMP burst to life, sending a shockwave of electromagnetic energy across the battlefield. The blast cut through space, leaving behind a trail of invisible energy that spread like ripples in a pond. It was a moment of pure, raw power, a flash of brilliance in the vastness of space. For a split second, everything went silent. Then the alien ships materialized. The cloaking devices failed, their shimmering energy fields faltering under the immense force of the EMP. The ships were now visible, vulnerable for the first time since the battle began. Blake's heart raced as he watched the massive warships reveal themselves, their sharp metallic edges gleaming in the light of distant stars. The Genesis's weapons systems roared to life. The crew had barely enough time to react, but Blake knew that this was their only chance. The torpedoes were fired with deadly precision, each shot aimed at the now exposed alien vessels. The explosions rocked the alien fleet, creating bursts of light that lit up the dark expanse of space. For the first time since the battle began, the alien fleet faltered. Blake allowed himself a moment of hope. He could see the damage to the alien ships, their shields flickering and faltering. The Genesis wasn't out of danger yet, but this was the breakthrough they needed. Blake watched his crew spring into action, firing everything they had at the weakened alien ships. But as Blake allowed himself a brief moment of triumph, tragedy struck. Bonner, the ship's chief engineer and one of the most brilliant minds aboard the Genesis, had been working tirelessly to repair critical systems. He had been all over the ship, from the engine room to the communications bay, ensuring that every piece of equipment was functioning. But as he scrambled to fix a vital system that was crucial to keeping the ship alive, disaster struck. A massive explosion ripped through the ship's lower decks, sending shockwaves through the hallways. Blake's blood ran cold as he heard the cry of his crew over the comms. "Bonner!" Sarah shouted, her voice filled with terror. Blake rushed to the control room, trying to make sense of the chaos. But it was too late. Bonner had given everything for the crew. He had been in the heart of the battle, fighting to keep the ship running, despite the odds. Now he was gone. The explosion had taken him, and the crew felt the loss deeply. Bonner had been the heartbeat of the Genesis, and without him, things were about to get a lot harder. Blake clenched his fists. The loss of Bonner was a blow that none of them could afford, but Blake knew that they couldn't afford to grieve. Not yet. His crew needed him now more than ever. Everyone, focus, Blake shouted, his voice sharp with authority. Bonner gave his life for us. We owe it to him to finish this fight. We're not stopping until the last alien ship is destroyed. We're fighting for him, and for all of humanity. The crew responded with renewed determination. The loss of Bonner was painful, but it fueled their resolve. The EMP blast had given them the edge they needed, but now they had to press forward. The aliens, while vulnerable, were still a powerful force, and the Genesis was still far from safe. Blake's mind raced as he formulated a plan, but one thing was certain: they would fight until the very end. The alien fleet, though shaken, wasn't ready to surrender. Their commanders, including Admiral Kylan, were furious. Blake had exposed their vulnerability, and now they would retaliate with everything they had. The battle was far from over. But with the alien fleet reeling from the EMP blast and the crew of the Genesis fighting with the strength of their fallen comrade, Blake knew that humanity was no longer the underdog. They were fighting with every ounce of ingenuity and determination they had. And in that moment, Blake saw the faintest glimmer of hope. It was small, barely noticeable in the vast darkness of space, but it was enough. They were still alive, and as long as they were, they would keep fighting. The space around the Genesis was a war zone. The battle raged on with an intensity that shook the very core of the human ship. Alien warships, their once imposing structures now damaged and vulnerable, floated like giant metal carcasses in the cold vacuum of space. The Genesis, old, battered, and on the brink of collapse, was pushing through, defying all odds. The EMP had exposed the enemy's weakness, and now Captain Blake knew they had to make their final push to destroy the alien flagship, the heart of the fleet. The crew, battle-worn and exhausted, were working with desperation in their eyes. Each member had felt the loss of Bonner, the ship's brilliant engineer, and each one carried that pain with them as they fought. But now there was no time to mourn. Their only goal was victory. Blake's orders were clear. They were going to destroy the flagship or die trying. The Genesis shook violently as another alien ship tried to ram them. The aging hull groaned under the pressure, but Blake refused to pull back. His grip tightened on the controls as he steered the ship through the debris field of the wrecked alien vessels. The ship's lights flickered and sparks flew from exposed circuits, but Blake didn't flinch. The crew was holding on, refusing to give up despite the overwhelming odds. "Full throttle," Blake shouted, his voice echoing through the command deck. "Push through. We're taking down that flagship, no matter what." The crew responded with a chorus of grunts and nods. Even though the ship was barely holding together, their hearts burned with a single purpose: to take down the heart of the enemy. The massive alien warships that surrounded them were now in disarray. The Genesis had found its opening, and they were going to use it. The scene outside the ship was chaotic. Alien ships, once cloaked and nearly impossible to target, were now visible and vulnerable. The Genesis launched its remaining torpedoes with precision, each one finding its mark and exploding with a violent force. Massive bursts of light tore through space as the torpedoes detonated, sending debris raining down across the battlefield. It was an awe-inspiring sight. Explosions rippling across the cold blackness of space, fireballs blazing against the backdrop of distant stars. Blake's heart raced as he looked out at the wreckage. The battle was brutal, and the Genesis was taking heavy hits. He knew they didn't have much time. The alien forces were regrouping, and their retaliation was inevitable. But the Genesis had a secret weapon, the last remaining torpedo. It was their final chance to destroy the flagship, and they had to get it to the enemy ship, no matter the cost. Sarah, Blake's brave first officer, stood beside him, her face grim but resolute. She had been with Blake from the very beginning, and she understood the gravity of the situation. "We're losing systems," she said through clenched teeth. "If we don't act now, we'll be sitting ducks." Blake nodded, his eyes narrowing in focus. "Prepare the torpedo. I want it ready for launch as soon as we get in range." The countdown began. The Genesis pushed forward, barreling through the wreckage of the alien fleet. Alien ships attempted to engage them, firing their weapons, but the human ship was relentless. It swerved, dodging incoming fire with every turn, its pulse cannons firing back with fury. Each blast that hit the alien ships sent them reeling, but the Genesis wasn't unscathed. The ship was falling apart piece by piece. The outer hull was cracked, and the interior was filled with smoke and sparks from the constant damage. But the crew fought on. With every explosion that rocked the ship, the crew members gritted their teeth and pushed harder. Every inch of the Genesis was being tested, but no one gave up. In the midst of this chaos, Sarah made her way to the torpedo room. The last remaining torpedo was locked and loaded, ready to be fired. But as she reached the door, an explosion shook the ship. The entire hallway was filled with smoke and debris. The blast had taken out the ship's outer engines, and the torpedo chamber was now sealed off, the only way through blocked by fire and rubble. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at the destruction around her. There was no time to waste. If they were going to destroy the flagship, they needed the torpedo launched now. The crew couldn't wait. They had to finish this fight. She made a decision. Without hesitation, Sarah moved toward the sealed door, knowing that getting the torpedo ready would mean certain death. The blast had left her with no choice but to make a sacrifice. With a fierce determination, she grabbed the emergency tools and began to work on the door. Sparks flew as she cut through the metal, her hands steadied despite the heat and danger. The clock was ticking. Sarah could hear the sounds of the battle raging around her. The Genesis was running out of time. The flagship was still in their sights, and their last shot was about to slip away. As she finally pried the door open, the room was filled with light, but Sarah didn't have time to celebrate. The explosion had triggered a chain reaction in the ship's reactor core, and the entire ship was about to go critical. Sarah knew that the torpedo had to reach its target. She was willing to give her life to ensure that humanity had a fighting chance. "Captain," she shouted into the comms, her voice steady but strained. "The torpedo is ready, but I need to launch it now, or we lose everything." Blake's voice crackled over the comms, filled with urgency. "Sarah, get to the launch bay. We'll cover you." But Sarah knew that wasn't an option. She couldn't get there in time. The only way was to launch it manually. She ran to the control panel, her hands trembling as she activated the final sequence. The countdown began. As she hit the final button, the torpedo launched. It shot through the wreckage, speeding toward the alien flagship. Sarah's heart raced as she watched the screen. The torpedo closed in, its payload locked on target. The explosion was deafening. The flagship erupted in a massive fireball, its massive structure disintegrating into thousands of pieces as the torpedo struck its core. The alien fleet, once so mighty, was in chaos. The flagship was gone, and with it, the heart of the enemy's power. The crew of the Genesis had won, but victory came at a price. Sarah's sacrifice was not in vain. She had given everything to ensure that the alien fleet was destroyed. As Blake and the remaining crew members of the Genesis looked out at the wreckage of the alien fleet, they knew they had done the impossible. The battle had been long and brutal, but humanity had struck back. The Genesis had won the day, but the cost was great. As the stars blinked peacefully above, the crew knew that this was only the beginning. Humanity had proven that they could fight and win, no matter the odds. And with that, Blake vowed to continue the fight. The moment the torpedoes struck the alien flagship, the entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath. The massive warship, once the heart of the alien fleet, exploded in a blinding flash of light. It was as if the stars themselves had ignited. Debris from the once imposing flagship rained down across the vast expanse of space, drifting in the cold void like remnants of a forgotten empire. Captain Blake stared at the spectacle through the viewport of the Genesis. The blast had been the final blow to the alien fleet, and it was a victory that no one could have predicted. But as the last of the alien ships turned and fled, Blake's heart was heavy. The battle was won, but at what cost? The Genesis was a wreck. Its hull was scared, and its systems were failing. The crew had given everything they had, fighting, surviving, and holding on against a technologically superior enemy. Yet, in the end, it was the human spirit, the unyielding will to survive, that had carried them through. Blake glanced at his crew, battered and bloodied, but with a fierce determination in their eyes. They had done the impossible. They had defeated the alien eye, a force that had once seemed invincible. But the victory was bittersweet. As the remaining alien ships retreated, their once proud armada dissolving into the cold void of space, Blake allowed himself a moment of silence. His thoughts were with the fallen. Bonner, the ship's brilliant engineer, had given his life to keep the Genesis running long enough for them to reach the final confrontation. Sarah, his trusted first officer, had sacrificed herself to ensure that the torpedo would reach its target. She had made the ultimate sacrifice, knowing that without her, humanity's chance for victory would have slipped away. Blake stood silently in front of a small memorial on the Genesis, a place where the names of the fallen crew members had been carved. Bonner's name was first on the list, and Blake placed a hand on the cold metal surface of the memorial. "We did it, for Earth, for humanity," he whispered softly, recalling Bonner's last words before his death. Those words had been etched into Blake's memory. And now, more than ever, they seemed to carry the weight of the entire battle. The Genesis limped away from the battlefield, its engines barely functioning, and its hull riddled with scars from the brutal confrontation. Yet, as battered as the ship was, it flew proudly. The human crew, though exhausted and broken, stood tall. They had faced the unknown, a technologically superior enemy, and they had triumphed. The galaxy would remember this day, not just as a victory for the Genesis, but as a victory for all of humanity. They had proven that no matter the odds, the human spirit could never be crushed. The emotional toll of the battle was evident on every face. They had won, but they had lost so much. There were empty chairs in the mess hall, vacant spaces where crew members used to sit. The laughter and camaraderie that once filled the ship were now replaced with a quiet, somber tone. But even in the silence, there was a sense of pride. They had faced the worst and come out on top. Humanity had shown the universe what they were capable of. Blake walked through the corridors of the Genesis, stopping briefly at each memorial that had been placed for the fallen. He paused at Sarah's, remembering the strength she had shown in the face of certain death. She had done more than just lead the crew. She had inspired them. In the end, it was Sarah's sacrifice that had made all the difference. The crew was exhausted, but they had earned their rest. Blake knew that they would rebuild, that the Genesis would be repaired, and that humanity would continue to rise from the ashes of this brutal conflict. The aliens had underestimated them, thinking that Earth was just another insignificant planet in the galaxy. But now, the galaxy knew better. Humanity had proven that it was not to be taken lightly. As the Genesis slowly drifted away from the wreckage of the battle, Blake looked out at the stars. The silence of space seemed to echo the weight of their victory, but it also held the promise of the future. The fight against the alien eye had ended, but the war for humanity's place in the galaxy had just begun. Blake's voice crackled over the comms, a signal that all surviving crew members could hear. His voice was strong, unwavering, and full of resolve. "This is just the beginning. he said, his words carrying across the void of space. The galaxy now knows what happens when you mess with humanity. The words hung in the air like a challenge, an invitation to all who would dare to face them. The Genesis may have been battered and broken, but its crew had shown that they would never surrender. They had won the battle. But the war was far from over. Humanity had proven that it could fight, that it could survive, and that it would always rise again. As the Genesis sailed through the vast expanse of space, heading toward the unknown, Blake stood tall. He wasn't just a captain now. He was a symbol of humanity's resilience, of their strength in the face of impossible odds. The victory over the alien fleet was just the beginning. The galaxy had been put on notice. Humanity would not be forgotten. And as Blake gazed out at the stars, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, humanity would face them head-on. They had proven that they were capable of anything. The Genesis continued its journey through space, its silhouette against the stars a testament to the human spirit, to the power of resilience and determination. And as it sailed toward the future, Blake and his crew knew that they had already made their mark on the galaxy. The universe would never be the same again. For humanity had struck back.